The A-4 Skyhawk was the US Navy's first attempt to replace the piston-engined AD Skyraider from 1946. The A-4 was designed and built in just a couple of years, and when it was introduced, there was really nothing like it capable of operating from an aircraft carrier. The first prototype flew in 1954, and it promised significant potential. The new jet was fast for its time and actually briefly held the world speed record in a closed-course category, along with being able to carry a bomb load roughly equivalent to a World War II B-17 bomber. It did this with an airframe that was small enough to not need folding wings for carrier operations, and if all of that wasn't enough, it cost less than originally expected, both to purchase and to operate. The new Skyhawk jet was a clear win for the US Navy, and although it didn't end up directly replacing the AD Skyraider as originally hoped, it did go on to serve the US Navy in a frontline attack role well into the 1970s and into the 1990s with the US Marine Corps. During the Vietnam War, the A-4 flew a significant number of combat sorties, attacking everything from gunboats in the water to hardened military facilities on land. The air combat record of the A-4 over Vietnam was fairly small. One was shot down by a MiG-17 using cannon fire, and in turn, an A-4 also shot down a MiG-17 using a Zuni rocket. The Skyhawk went on to serve with a large number of export customers, with a small number of late-model upgrade planes still flying today. The B version we're looking at in the game was the first production upgrade, originally designated A-4D2, before the US military unified its aircraft designations. The A-4B featured a control system for the AGM-12 bullpup missile, an air refueling probe, and an upgraded navigation system along with some minor updates to the radio equipment. What we're looking at in War Thunder is the A-4B Skyhawk, a naval strike aircraft and rank 6 of the American tech tree at battle rating 8.7. The A-4B was actually one of the very first aircraft I ever covered on the channel, and we're giving it a fresh look in 2024. This jet doesn't get any kind of ballistics computer, or any sensors at all actually, but that shouldn't be a big surprise considering its battle rating. The plane's primary armament is a set of Mark 12 20mm cannons with 100 rounds per gun. These cannons sometimes don't hit very hard, but they can still be enough to engage other aircraft or light ground targets. For loadouts, the A-4B has 3 pylons that can carry racks of bombs, unguided rocket pods, larger individual bombs, gun pods, air-to-air missiles, and anti-tank missiles. The air-to-air missile you get is the AIM-9B. This is an entry-level, rear-aspect, caged-seeker infrared missile. It has very short range and only 10 Gs of pull, but since most of your opposition won't have any kind of countermeasures or anything, it's still a credible threat at this BR. The anti-tank missile is the AGM-12B. This is a manual command line-of-sight weapon, which means that you have to manually steer it into the target using some control keybinds. The good news is that it's got a pretty effective warhead for its BR, and this thing can usually take out almost any ground target it faces on a direct hit. If you need more info about using these, I'll put a link to my air-to-ground weapons tutorial in a pinned comment. In terms of flight performance, it's really best to think of the A-4B in 2 different ways, with or without a heavy weapon load. If you're loaded up with bombs or rocket pods or gun pods, the plane turns into a completely different aircraft, and not a very good one. With a loadout, this jet is seriously underpowered. The rate of climb is bad, the acceleration is awful, and its overall agility is terrible, especially in vertical maneuvers. In short, while this plane is loaded, the flight performance is totally uncompetitive with other aircraft at its BR. Without a weapon load, totally different aircraft. It still only has average engine power, but its acceleration and rate of climb are noticeably better. Not great, but better. Plus, thanks in part to its leading-edge slats, the agility opens up quite a bit with some careful flying. When it's light, the A-4 has a good roll rate and is capable of fairly decent instantaneous high-alpha maneuvers. But the downside to that is that the energy retention can be pretty awful if you snap too far too quickly. The agility turns into pretty hot garbo at low speeds, so if you're not careful, you can get a good maneuver or two, and then find yourself out of energy without really much you can do about it. Add to this, the wings rip off fairly easily in high G turns, especially if you've got a high fuel load, so it ends up being a little bit of a tightrope act to keep the A4 in a good, safe energy state. It has an air brake, which helps avoid control compression in a dive, and it can deploy combat flaps up to almost 600 kilometers an hour. Plus, when it takes off from a runway, it gets radopods, which you don't actually need to use on takeoff, so you can take them with you for a quick little extra boost. It may not be much, but those couple of little radopods have saved me more than a few times over the years. Taking the A-4B up into air battles is, again, a tale of two planes. As a bomber in air battles, you may find the A-4B to be a little frustrating. It no longer gets an air spawn, and it's slower than basically every other strike jet on the team. Your blue frenemies are going to beat you to the bases every time, and you'll generally only get to do base bombing if there just aren't other strike jets on the team. If and when you do, though, the napalm is currently still really strong. For farming AI ground units, things are a little bit easier, but you'll still be incredibly vulnerable to interception, and you may have to ditch your bomb load to defend yourself in air combat pretty frequently. If you want to use this as more of a conventional fighter, that can work, and the A4 can make a good showing of itself. Like other jets at this BR, the lack of flares does make it vulnerable to missiles, but if you manage your airspeed, the agility can turn it into a pretty credible dogfighter. I'm personally just awful at aiming the 20mm Colts and deflection shots, and you don't get a lot of ammo for them, which is a little unusual for American jets. But if you can make the Colts work and keep your fuel weight down, it's entirely possible to use the A-4B purely as a fighter. Close air support is, in my opinion, really where this jet shines. The huge weapon load can give it a lot of flexibility, with the Zuni rockets and 2,000-pound bomb being especially standout options for going up over a ground battle. No ballistics computer, but the SPAA isn't usually throwing missiles and stuff at you yet, so it's not as risky to go in close for easier drops and shots. The bullpups can be a little difficult to use, but on a direct hit, they'll pop basically anything in this BR range, and even the gun pods can be a credible threat against a lot of different ground targets. Overall, this plane really excels at close air support. Visually, the A4 is a pretty neat looking little jet, and the A4B in particular has a great selection of paint jobs available in the game, and tons more on War Thunder Live. You even get a couple of neat Argentine paint jobs, and I'd rate this plane pretty high for the visuals. Landing this jet isn't too difficult, but the main caveat is that the landing gear is very tall, and you'll flip over pretty easily if you try fishtailing on the runway to slow down. You can drop gear and landing flaps at about 400 kilometers an hour. Oh, and it's got an arrestor hook that you'll probably never get to use, but still, it's nice to know it's there, just in case a carrier shows up someday. The cockpit for the A4B is okay. The visibility isn't great, but the instruments are easy to find, and it's a fairly easy aircraft to fly, even if dogfights can be a little weird with the headset. Pretty average cockpit experience with this one. To close out on the A4B, this jet can carry a huge load of air-to-ground weapons. It gets bullpups, it gets a pair of sidewinders at a low BR, it gets radopods, and it's fairly agile if you keep the weight down. However, no ballistics computer, it ain't fast, but it sure is slow, and it's got a low ammo count for the cannons. The final verdict on the A4B Skyhawk is that ever since the Snail took away its air spawn, this plane's utility for ground attack and air battles has dropped off significantly. It's still very effective at close air support, and it can do heavy damage in air battles if you actually reach the targets, but without that air spawn, It's just not as good as it used to be. Maybe again someday. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.